Good morning, Artificial Hearts family. We are here for another amazing, fantastic episode with a very special guest, all the way from Richard. Is it Washington, D.C.?
Washington, outside of Washington, D.C.
Outside Washington, D.C., Richard Foltin. So I'm very happy to have him here with us on our platform. I had the honor of meeting Richard when I was an intern at the Freedom Forum at the Religious Freedom Center. And I want Richard maybe to introduce himself to our audience, and that's how we do it here, Richard. And we want to offer this opportunity now for you to tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're coming, and what you're currently doing.
Sure. So first of all, it's good to see you again, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your program and to talk about some really important issues of the day. So just by way of introduction, I'm a native of New York City. My parents were Holocaust survivors. They came to New York after the war, and I grew up. Went to public schools. Ultimately, was an undergraduate at New York University. I have a law degree from Harvard Law School, and jumping ahead very quickly, spent many years at the American Jewish Committee as first in their legal office and then as working on domestic policy and advocacy in Washington, D.C. I began in New York. I left AJC, several years ago, following which I became a fellow for religious freedom at the Freedom Forum, which is where we met. I continue in that role to this day. But in addition, starting about the beginning of 2024, I became executive director of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, which is a voluntary bar association of the Jewish American legal community, and that works to promote the interests and well-being of the Jewish legal community, of Jews generally, and also supports and works on human rights issues that are of concern, should be of concern to everybody, regardless of their affiliation or background. So that brings me to where we are today, and I continue to work on religious freedom issues, both at the Freedom Forum and then in other places as well. I remain. The last thing I'll mention is I'm also affiliated with the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice at the American Bar Association, where I co-chair a committee on religious freedom. So that's an pertinent part of some of my background.
And before we dive deep into kind of some of the nitty-gritty and some of the questions that we discussed beforehand, I know you have this very impressive resume, but I was just curious, and I think our the folks who are going to be watching this, they're very curious to know who or what were some of the inspirations for you to become this person that you have become, to embark on this journey as an attorney, as a legal counsel, going through Harvard Law School, and having all these important experiences.
Well, it's a combination of things. I mean, first of all, as one is being educated, you learn what interests you and what you want to be involved in. And it goes back to a course I took as an undergraduate, an American Constitution, that was taught by, I believe, by somebody who was a candidate for Master of Law at NYU Law School. And right away, I was fascinated by the topic. I was especially interested in the religious freedom pieces that he touched upon. And that was something I continued with in law school, several courses on Constitution. Went to work at a law firm for a while, but the attraction of being able to work on these issues is what ultimately brought me to the American Jewish Committee. But in addition to the sort of academic background, I mean, the fact is, I mentioned already, I'm a child of Holocaust survivors, and I don't know that I was aware of it at the time, but as I look back on it now, I think I was always aware of how fragile our civil rights and civil liberties are, how fragile the very society in which we live is, that it may not take long from being in what you think is a stable environment with protections of all of these important rights and protections of minorities to slip into a situation where minorities are not protected, where civil rights are not respected. I don't want to get into parallels too much at the moment about modern times,
No, for sure. Yeah.
but maybe we'll get into some of that. But I think that the idea of being involved in work that would strengthen those protections and protect people, as I say, especially in the context of religious freedom, which I just always found really fascinating, uh, was I think that was part of the reason why I went on to do the work that I did. Although I think to some extent I didn't really realize that so much until later on in my life.
No, I think that's incredible, what you just said. And I agree with you. I think obviously we have to be careful not to extrapolate, but it's one of those
Mhm.
things. I don't know who said it, but freedom is something that every generation has to preserve, right? And I think there's so much
Mhm.
stuff that we tend to take for granted. We think that things will always stay the same. It's just, I guess it's just how our human minds work. We
Mhm.
operate on the base of regularity, and we assume that things will always be the way that they were. And this very precious right, which is something that I think unites all of us, which is religious liberty, is something that each generation has to preserve. And I think that's something that unites us. You know, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist. You're a member of a Jew, and I wanted to ask you. I think religious freedom, the concerns for different religious communities, all of us care about it, but maybe the emphasis that we give to it comes in different ways. And I noticed both at my time when I was working at the Freedom Center as an intern that different religious communities, they have different issues that are particularly important to them. And as somebody, as you mentioned, as somebody who's a child of Holocaust survivors, somebody who's Jewish, what are areas in the Jewish community that are particularly important in this area of religious freedom and human rights?
So as our viewers I think will know, the Constitution protects religious freedom in a couple of ways. There's the religion clauses, which prohibit both government establishment of religion and also protects free exercise of religion from abridgment by the state. And I think the Jewish concerns, by and large, and let me rush to say nobody can speak for all the Jewish community.
Exactly right. It's not,
Everything I
not trying
say,
to lie.
somebody will
Yeah.
disagree with. But as I see it, the concerns of the Jewish community come out of both of those concerns. So, in the first place, the no establishment concern. If you're, there was a long history in this country of having public schools that had state-sponsored prayer. You had Bible readings in the school, and the prayers they had, and the selections from the Bible they were reading were not necessarily anything that was responsive to or likely to make a Jewish student feel comfortable being there. I'm old enough to still remember when they would begin assembly when I was in elementary school with a reading from the Bible. It was a very thick Bible, must have been very big print, and half the readings I would say were from what's from the what you all may call the Old Testament, or we call the Hebrew Bible, uh, and then the other readings would be from the New Testament. And even as a child, I just felt really uncomfortable. It clearly was not my speaking to me or intended to make me feel included. So there are so that set of concerns about schools not writing prayers, not having official prayers. It's often said that there will always be prayer in schools as long as there are math tests. And so this is not about what an individual can do or being able to say grace or other prayer when they eat, but what is something that's an official school-sponsored kind of prayer and observation was clearly something that not only I responded to, but I think has historically been a concern of a large part of the Jewish community, that we not be made to feel like outcasts, like outsiders when we send our children to public schools or in other settings that are official government settings. So that's one set of issues. The other big set of issues for a long time has been accommodation of religious practices, which falls more under the free exercise side. And there, both in the workplace, at schools, uh, in the world at large, uh, it's very important that people not have to leave their religious observance and their religious identity at the door no more than they can or should leave their identity, but depending on what racial or ethnic group they belong to, uh, or on the basis of sexual orientation, anything else that's an intrinsic part of who they are, uh, people have to be able to do the job. They have to be, when they go to school, they need to be they need to fulfill the requirements of what the school is expecting of them. And at the same time, uh, there should be an accommodation that allows people to fully participate in the workplace, to fully participate in the school, that takes into account the existential reality of people who are compelled, who feel commanded to observe their faith and are restricted in certain ways, whether it be days on which they are available to work, or whether it be the way in which they are dressed or groomed. These have religious or can have religious implications, and that ought to be respected and accommodated, just as, we have come to expect that people with disabilities are accommodated, so that they are able to fully be part of the workplace, do the job, and yet have their special needs met as well. So I see these things as very much in the same category of having a society that's open to all, and that issue of accommodation, whether it be again in the workplace or in schools or in others, in prisons and the military, wherever folks may be, that there is a reasonable accommodation of their religious practices, and so that I think has been a issue that unites many in the Jewish community, even many folks who aren't the observant themselves, but they understand it's important for folks of Jewish background or of any other religious background to be able to participate fully in our society.
And I guess just following up on that, practical examples of that would be Sabbath observance,
Sure.
kosher or a halal foods, those
Mhm.
kinds of exemptions, right? For those
Sure.
and, religious holy days and religious attires.
Yes, all of those. I mean, and it cuts. I mean, these issues come up again in the workplace. They come up in schools. They come up in settings where military or prison. Not to compare them, but military or prison settings. Any place people are present, these issues can always come up and should be addressed.
And just sorry, and on that question, I thought it was very important the school prayer that we know that was a huge issue in in those decisions in the 60s, Abington
Mhm.
Camp. And so I guess a lot of people, especially maybe our more conservative brethren, they think that we're trying to secularize. What would you say to that? Is that about secular? Would you say it's more about including those that might not feel comfortable, who are also taxpayers, but don't necessarily subscribe to the
Yeah.
tenets of the Christian New Testament?
So I think it's important to make a distinction between something that's secular versus secularist.
Okay, good.
Something that's if somebody is secularist, that it's almost evangelical in a way. Not only they should be secular and or not a believer, but everybody else should be. And that's not clearly not the roles of schools, which need to be neutral with respect to religion, neither endorsing, not disparaging religion, not encouraging it, leaving it to the individual, to their families. And so in recognizing that, what I think is important is, if you say that everything that's not religious is therefore conveying another kind of religious perspective, you basically are erasing the First Amendment, because the framers clearly understood that there was such a thing as free exercise of religion and non-establishment, which you can't, those principles make no sense if you believe that everything that's not religious is therefore secularist. So clearly they had in mind, and I think it makes sense to say that there's a common ground that we need to be able to operate within our public sphere, our public institutions in a way that's respectful of both those who are secular and who have a belief in whether they're agnostic or atheist or whatever their beliefs might be, and they and people who have a religious faith need to be able to function in the same environment and can cooperate. And then, those who are religious have their own institutions, both in their private life and their religious institutions, where they are able to be fully observant, to be not just observant, to express their faith in a way that in an environment that's encouraging to and supports their belief. But that's not the role of public institutions. They exist to be common ground in which people of all different backgrounds can come together and work together.
Well, fantastic. I think that's an excellent kind of segue to next question, which is talking just a little bit about the shape of religious freedom. I know we could have a whole podcast just on that, but to just be maybe a little bit more specific, when we're talking about religious freedom, separation of church and state, and I know those are kind of two clauses that can be in tension at times. Does that preclude public displays of religion in the public square? How do you understand that as a specialist? Like,
Yeah.
how do you see kind of the content of religious freedom, in other words?
So, I
Broad
think
terms.
there's separation of church and state, but there's not absolute separation of church and state. It would be impossible to have two such fundamental institutions that are a key part of our society and really of societies everywhere have nothing to do with each other. So, uh, when it comes to expression, uh, what's not appropriate is for the government to do things that makes it look like it's endorsing a particular faith or religion in general. But that doesn't mean that it has to close the door to any expression of religion taking place, even in a public setting. And the way that happens is if you have a park or other place where people are entitled to use that space from time to time to express political ideas, other ideas, to have speeches or whatever, that there certainly should not be a bar to a religious viewpoint or religious organization making use of that public space on the same terms as any other organization. So, for instance, public schools that rent out auditoriums or make them available generally for private events taking place in that public setting, they have to treat religious institutions on the same basis as they would treat any
Mm.
other. So it's certainly not that you can't ever have something that some kind of religious expression in a public setting. Uh, but on the other hand, they should not be preferring those religious beliefs, and that's really the key thing. There's also, that the fact is that our public officials and others, they often engage what I would call expressions of civil religion. That is to say, we have in God we trust in our coins. We have a pledge of allegiance that says, one nation under God, and one could be very strict about that and say all of that is unacceptable. But the fact is, we do have this notion that whatever those terms mean, it's not intended to be exclusionary, and it sort of recognizes the common heritage. And I don't think that's anything terrible as long as it's clear that there's a line that can't be crossed. And of course, if you have, as has been the case in the past, you have some student who, for instance, feels they can't say the Pledge of Allegiance because pledging allegiance to a country or saying a pledge that includes those words is inconsistent with their own beliefs and faith, they of course need not, there should be no pressure at all on such a student from being involved in those activities. In fact, that would be unconstitutional for that to be happening. So again, there's not an absolute separation of church and state, but there's some permeability simply because that's the nature of life. Uh, but I think there have to be lines drawn that prevent it again from seeming like the government is endorsing a particular religion or endorsing religion in general.
Well, fantastic. I think that's a great segue to our next block. And before we get there, I want to do a little bit of merchandise from our artificial hearts mug. And this mug here, Richard, it has a quote from one of our founding fathers of religious freedom here in the US, Roger Williams, where he says, "It is the will and command of God that since the coming of his son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, and anti-Christian consciences and worship be granted to all men, to all nations and countries, and they are only to be fought against with that sword which is only in soul matters able to conquer, to wit, the sword of the Spirit, the word of God." So we'll also be gifting you this, Richard, as a courtesy, as a token of our appreciation for you being here. But this quote from Roger Williams, I think it reaffirms one of these bedrock principles on which this nation was founded, which are the principles of religious freedom and separation of church and state. We know the colony of Providence Plantation, today the state of Rhode Island, it witnessed a lively experiment in religious freedom that has impacted We see it right through the founding, through Madison and the First Amendment, with these provisions that Congress shall make no law abridging, making establishment of religion or abridging the free exercise thereof. And in light of that, Richard, in light
Let
of
me just say
yeah, please,
something, a
please,
word
please.
about Roger Williams and about
Yeah,
that quote, which I think demonstrates clearly I don't subscribe to the part of that reading that had to do with our Lord Jesus Christ.
right,
Uh,
right,
but
yeah,
but I think what that quotation points out is you can remain faithful to your own faith, to your own religion, be a bit adherent, and yet at the same time respect those of all faiths, including people that don't share those particular beliefs. That the obligation to respect freedom of conscience and freedom of religion extends across the board. There was a time when, as you may know, the Congress begins each day with a prayer, a word of prayer,
yeah,
often from members of different faith groups. And, and that's another one of those things like the Pledge of Allegiance, where, one might argue that a really strict separation of church and state wouldn't countenance that, but it's there. It's part of our tradition. And there was a point at which they began to have non-Christian uh, clergy come and deliver these opening prayers. And there, to this day, there are people that object if somebody from the wrong faith group, usually it's not Jews that set them off, but say Hindus or
yeah.
or some other faith group, and they protest this, that this shouldn't be happening in our Congress. And of course, quite the opposite is true. It absolutely should be happening in our Congress, that we show and demonstrate our respect for people of all faiths, of whatever their background, and that if we're going to have members of the clergy who are Christians or Jews delivering that opening prayer, then by all means, we need to have people of other faith groups as well.
Oh, that's great. And yeah, just to wrap up, maybe kind of our shared appreciation for Roger Williams. Yeah, he uses the analogy of a boat. He says that all the religions are like in the boat, and it's only in the end of time that God will judge. So it's not up to us to in the public sphere, right? Even though we might have our own particular theological convictions and beliefs about the truth. But in the public sphere, we have this obligation in the moment and in time that we're living in. That was his belief, to live and coexist together. And America, I think, has been kind of a beacon of that in its history. It has achieved something very unique. But at least my experience, I can just to give you a little bit of context on my side. I came here in the late 90s. I was 6 years old. And it felt the 90s was a very different America than the America that I'm living through now. And you don't have to agree with that, but I wanted to know from your background and as somebody who's a specialist who's on the front lines of this, what do you think are some of the rising threats that you see today, both domestically, especially domestic, I think that, but if you can also talk about abroad, to this fundamental human right, which is the right of religious freedom, and also if you want to talk about also the separation of church and state.
Sure. So, I think the erosion of separation of church and state is one of the great concerns I have as you watch what's happening
Mm.
in the courts, as you look at some of the arguments that are being made, including by the government, that seem to me to be a danger to the continuing viability of the no establishment principle, which is so essential to protecting religious freedom. When I started in this business, they were members of the Supreme Court who were both very strong in support of the no establishment principle and very strong in support of of protection of free exercise. These were not contradictory. I mean, some of my college experience, I remember as a college student wondering about that, whether these principles were not in tension. And I don't think they should be understood to be in tension. I think both of these principles have the same effect of saying that there are no orthodoxies in this country, and that people need to be able to find, and communities, they need to be part of communities as well. Community is essential to most religious identities, that they need to be able to find their own way without support or interference from the state. And somehow that has become eroded. Uh, you've had at times some justices, I think Justice Stevens was a representative of this who wanted a very strong establishment clause, not a terribly strong free exercise clause, which had the potential really of running over very essential protections of free exercise. You had some judges that wanted both of these clauses to be sort of weak, that they just really couldn't go to court to vindicate either of these interests in free exercise or establishment clause. But what we have today is an ever-eroding protection against the establishment of religion, at the same time, an extension of the free exercise principle to a point that even I, as a very strong advocate of protection of free exercise, I'm concerned about where they're going, where you're not in this. So let's talk about the case involving Coach Kennedy and at the Bremerton School District,
Right.
where
Could you just explain a little, maybe for the folks that
okay,
have,
so basically that's a case involving a coach, a fairly recent case involving a football coach who, at the end of the football game, engaged in prayer on the field, and ostensibly after the game was over and after school hours were over, and ostensibly without forcing any of the students to participate with him, but in fact, by all appearances, it was something where the students were in fact being invited to and did participate with the coach, and it certainly gave the appearance of being a school endorsed activity, even though the court ultimately found that it was not. And I think that that was not really a correct understanding of what was going on. So the point about the case is that this is not about the coach's ability to engage in prayer after a game, to go off on his own time in his own place and do that. But it is about what somebody as a school official should be allowed to do in a way that doesn't, that can be seen as coaxing and coercing students to participate in a religious observance. So the court in that case did a couple of things. One, I think they engaged in a sort of disingenuous reading of what was going on in order to justify it. But they also sort of read out of the law many of the strong protections against the establishment of religion, to the point that it's increasingly difficult to find cases in which the court will find that something is a violation of the no establishment principle. I wouldn't say impossible to do so. I think if somebody would engage, an official would engage in unmistakable coercion directed at a student, directing them to participate in prayers at the beginning of a class day or something like that, I tend to think even this court would still find that to be unconstitutional. But it is a narrowing window in terms of those kinds of cases. And the other thing they did that was really troubling was to say that if where there's an arguable free exercise interest, right, to engage in some activity, it's not a bar to allowing it to say that you have establishment concerns. That is, a government official's concern about not violating the no establishment principle unless there's an actual violation of the no establishment principle. That's not a basis for them to say, oh, we're not going to allow that because it's going to look like we're endorsing religion. So the establishment clause has been so you have a situation of this very strong free exercise principle and a very weak establishment clause principle, and you're losing this balance that was in place that I think was the best protection for the religious liberty interests of minorities of all kinds, that they not be put in a position where they might be made to feel like outsiders. I'm thinking here of what Justice O'Connor used to call the non-endorsement test, that it shouldn't look like government is endorsing religion because of what that does to people of minority faiths.
wow.
So
Is this something that I mean, kind of just following up on that, is it one maybe aisle of the court, or is this something you see across the board regardless of let's say ideological, partisan, or political leanings? Is it this erosion of like the establishment and preference for the free exercise? Is this something, can you trace this to party lines, or do you see this erosion of the
I think
establishment across the board?
there always was resistance. Even after the court very clearly back in the 60s very clearly said that you couldn't have officially sanctioned prayer in schools, and you couldn't you couldn't have Bible readings, you couldn't have you couldn't have prayers in which a teacher led the prayers. Those practices continued to this day in parts of the country. And there was just the resistance that many people felt that this was, that this was either formally a Christian nation
Mm.
or was a nation founded in Christian culture, whatever the rationale was. There was a resistance to complying with these clear edicts of the Supreme Court. And I think that never went away, even though I knew of people who were themselves lawyers with very conservative Christian groups who actually thought the court got it right back in the 60s,
Oh,
who
right.
said, yes, yeah, yeah, that, uh, not all of them, but I'm just saying that this was not an unusual thing I mean, one lawyer in particular who did work with evangelicals who said to me, we were against that decision when it came down, but we now realize it was the right thing for the court to do. But there always was that resistance, and I think it has grown as the tensions within our society over a range of issues, whether it be abortion or end of life issues, sexual orientation. There are these huge cultural schisms in our country, and I think those feed into. I mean, it's a dynamic in which each thing feeds on the other. But those schisms in our society have led to a sense that in some quarters that one of the problems is religion isn't playing a prominent part enough in our life, and we've got to somehow bring it back into the public square. Never mind that for each of these issues, you will find people, religious people, people of strong faith who believe totally opposite things.
Right.
So that there's not a Christian view or a Jewish view about any of these
Yeah.
issues, but nevertheless, there are people who seem to think that's in fact the norm.
Right.
That to their mind, you're not a true Christian or not really Jewish if you don't see these issues the same way I do, which of course is antithetical to concepts of individual conscience and of freedom of religion.
Wow. No,
But I think this is a dynamic which has fed the effort to sort of go back to an older version of what was permitted in society and what public institutions were allowed to do.
wow. No, and I think that leads us into something that I'm very interested in. And like I told you, the perception I have is that the culture shifts are changing in the US. America 2025 from America in 1999. It seems very different. Maybe it's not different. Maybe people are the same. It's just that now we have social media and they can and we're hearing what they would otherwise say in private, right? But
Mhm.
one, I think something that's been trending and that I've been hearing, at least the algorithm on the news, is the question of anti-Semitism, right? I think that's something that we can't ignore. We both on college campuses, I went to I did, you see it on these major universities. I know we could have an entire episode on this, but could you maybe briefly kind of explain this kind of prejudice, this kind of hatred, and how this you see this phenomenon being manifested in U.S. mainstream pop culture? I think this is a timely moment that we're having this
Yeah.
discussion. I know, like rappers like Kanye West, they just threw out like this horrible, putrid song that isn't worth mentioning or giving attention, but it highlights the mainstreaming of these ideas that we
Yeah.
would never think we would see. I never thought I would see in my lifetime. Like I told you, I came here when I was six in 1999, and there was this kind of ubiquitous harmony between Protestant Catholics and Jews. And almost, people talk about Judeo-Christian. They used these kinds of terms. And it seems that now our society is becoming more polarized, and we're seeing the rise of uh, anti-Semitism, not only on what was more common, I think, and you don't have to agree with this, but on kind of the extreme left. But now we're seeing it even on the right that tended to have this more philo-Semitic rhetoric. So I wanted to know maybe your thoughts on
Yeah.
this and explain maybe to our audience a little, educate our audience a little bit more about this.
So I think historically in the United States, it was the opposite of what you just said, which is to say there was the phenomenon of anti-Semitism on the right, especially the far right. We're talking about, I mean,
Oh, you're talking about like the 40s, right? The
No, I mean, just, if you go through into the, through the 90s, certainly, if you'd asked most American Jews where the greatest threat of anti-Semitism was, they would have said it's coming from the right. It's
Oh,
coming
Pat Buchanan.
well, they sort of, at an extreme neo-Nazis, but then moving inward from that to folks that were not, that as awful as that, but people like uh, uh, in some levels, Pat Buchanan, I think would be fair to talk about uh, some of the really nasty things he said at times. I was actually in a program with Pat Buchanan
Oh,
one
you
time,
were. Oh, sorry.
having to push back. No, and had to push back against some of the really terrible things that he said at that time. More about Israel. I mean, much of the anti-Jewish animus sometimes gets wrapped up together with anti-Israel animus, and they're very much feed on each other. But the point I wanted to make is that what has been the great shock we've gone from has been the emergence of this virulent anti-Semitism on both the right and on the left. And uh, the fact is that there was a time when you couldn't hear these kinds of sentiments in polite society. I mean, after the war and after the Holocaust, it was, only on the extremes of the right, for the most part, could you hear this kind of stuff about Jews being said. And I think it's important to understand about anti-Semitism that unlike, there are prejudices and biases against all segments of our society, racial discrimination and bigotry on the basis of people's ethnic groups, on the basis of their particular faith, all kinds of bigotries that have always existed in society, and I suppose always will at some level. But the thing to understand about anti-Semitism is it's at its root, it's a conspiracy theory about the role of Jews in the world. And it doesn't take much for it to emerge that, the Jews, you'll hear people say they're in control of the media, they're in control of the banks, all this stuff. And Jews have always been whatever people in society view as the worst possible thing, that's what Jews are condemned for. So Jews are condemned for being capitalists and they're condemned for being
I
communists.
mean,
They're condemned for being too liberal and they're condemned for being too conservative. And on and on. One just could go through all these categories. Uh, when society organized around religious ideas, the Jews were condemned for being, anti-Christian, killers of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. Then, racial notions emerged. The Nazis, of course, were hated the Jews for not being Aryan, not being pure enough racially, not to mention that, conspiracy theories were very much part of that as well. And today, in a world in which we're very concerned about uh, responding to oppressors and to colonialism and to violations of human rights, uh, Jews somehow become portrayed as the ultimate violators of human rights, the ultimate oppressors, which is pretty amazing, given the recent history of the Jewish people, that we somehow become cast as oppressors. And the other thing that happens is, you have some folks that think, well, they can disguise, they can speak in this way because they're talking about Zionists, as if, 80% of Jews, I would say, if not more, are supporters of the concept of the state of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people. So if you're saying you're only anti-Zionist, you're really saying you're anti-Jewish. So all these things get wrapped up together, and you wind up with these expressions of anti-Semitism that come very strongly from the left and the right, and part of that I think has to do with the way in which people are being educated in the current environment to see certain things as wrong, and there are things that are wrong in society that need to be addressed, histories of discrimination and oppression that need to be addressed, but those turn into caricatures in which uh, people generally are identified and are castigated based on their membership in a group over which they have no control. And then on top of that, it becomes the apotheosis of this is the characterization of Jews as some kind of an oppressive class. To the extent that one can disregard and not even talk about, they'll say you shouldn't even talk about anti-Semitism because then you're just strengthening this oppressor class by
oh,
acknowledging the history of the harm that was done to them. So just in the last few days, there's a memorial site involving victims of the Holocaust in Europe where somebody spray painted the word propaganda over that site. Because to remember what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust is to somehow propagandize and erase the terrible things that Israel is supposedly doing. So, I mean, it's a big, complicated story, but the fact is, uh, that the uplifting of a particular narrative, the ignoring of the narrative of the Jewish people, to lift up somebody else's narrative, and this building of the conspiracy theory involving Jews that's picked up on both the left and the right, has sort of brought us to where we are now. And I'll finish by saying one of the big problems we have, even for people that are more in the center and more well-meaning, is the problem that they have in seeing the problem on their side of the political spectrum. So folks on the left, even the center left, they look at conservatives, they look at Republicans, and they say, oh, that's where the problem is. That's where the anti-Semitism is. And the folks and they don't see it in their own
Right.
square. And on the other side, I've seen plenty of times that, Republicans / conservatives will say, well, the problem is all coming from the Democrats. How can any Jew be a member of the Democratic Party these days? And they don't see or respond to the problems on their side of the political spectrum. So there's a failure. I'll invoke a biblical phrase here. There's a failure to see the mote in one's own eye,
Yeah, yeah.
in seeing the faults of other parts of the community and not looking internally to see what it is that's being done wrong and in an insensitive fashion at best in terms of the way in which Jews are treated.
Wow. No, and kind of in light of that, I think something that kind of is at the forefront of public discussion is the question of anti-Semitism. Like what counts as anti-Semitism, especially I think in the context of US college campuses. And I wanted maybe to hear from you what are your thoughts on the origin of this controversy? And I think the other thing is like how can we have a balanced discussion on this, right? Because I think this is an area maybe where you have religious freedom versus free speech. How can we kind of balance this concern for, let's say, groups that have opposing views manifesting their views without violating somebody's religious freedom or without divulging into racism, anti-Semitism, or something that would be like considered beyond the pale of legitimacy.
So it's a big topic. So let me say just two or three things about it. First is just in terms of fundamental free speech principles, one is entitled to say even the most distasteful things and have the freedom of have their free speech protected. I mean, those of us of a certain age uh, well remember when the ACLU came out protecting the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, through a neighborhood that was largely populated by Holocaust survivors. And one may have agree or disagree with whether or not the principle was properly invoked in that case. The idea, broadly speaking, is correct that uh, we in America the concept has long been that hate speech, unlike in Europe and other places, that hate speech is not in principle subject to government prohibition and has to be allowed to take place, none of which takes away the right of others using their free speech to condemn what's being said and to respond to it. So if hate speech is being espoused on a campus or anywhere else, it's really troubling that school officials don't think it's part of their role oftentimes to condemn what's being said, even if they feel they have to allow it to be said. Uh, the other thing, though, is that in the context of a campus and in a workplace, there's such a thing as a hostile work environment or a hostile educational environment, and that puts some limitation on what has to be allowed to take place, so that members of all groups can feel like this is a place where they can work and they can learn. And I think on college campuses, things have been allowed to happen that were the target of those demonstrations and those activities. Members of other minority groups, Black, other minority faith groups. I think that if the official response would have been much stronger, at the very least in condemning it, if not of taking action to see that things that go over the line create a hostile environment are not allowed to take place. There's a particular problem in classrooms where you've got a teacher and a professor who really has control over the classroom and exercise authority and power over the students. So that's part of it, that you've got to allow things to be said sometimes that are deeply distasteful, and at the same time recognize that there are times when it goes over the line. The other piece of it is, and a lot of this has come out now in some of the cases in which students or people connected with the educational environments are being subject to deportation proceedings and such. They it's one thing to say, well, you can't do that because what they're saying is a First Amendment protected activity. It's another thing to say that they're allowed, in the name of the whatever cause they're espousing, to intimidate other students, to harass them, to even assault them, to treat Jewish students differently than other students because you have you have an ostensible political gripe with what the university is doing, and you hold the Jewish students out as proxies. All of this is not it's not something that the First Amendment and free speech interests need to protect. When Jewish students are trying to cross a campus and they are uniquely subject to a litmus test where they're asked, are they Zionists? Do they support the state of Israel? So first of all, the very question itself, I think, is
Yeah.
is discrimination. I mean, not only the Jewish students are being singled out, but they're being asked to denounce an essential part of their identity, which you would not countenance in any other context. Uh, but also, the general actions of intimidation, harassment, and property destruction, all of the other things that have taken place on campuses, it's not violating anybody's free speech to say, that's not allowed. We're going to discipline you if it takes place. Perhaps even, could even lead to expulsion. That's not a danger to free speech. That's a protection of the norms of the university in a way that's essential to protecting other students and protecting the educational mission of those institutions. And I think, thankfully, some of these schools are finally, that have let things go, are starting to wake up and say, we're not going to allow these things. You can make an application to have a demonstration of, time, place, and manner restriction is appropriate. And you can say, you can pretty much say whatever you want there, but you can't use those activities as a vehicle to disrupt the campus generally, and certainly not to engage in intimidation and harassment that's directed against particular students because of their ethnic or religious identity. All of that goes well beyond any notion of what free speech requires to be protected.
Wow. No, and kind of in light of that, where do you see the direction? What are maybe some of your expectations for the future of religious freedom and human rights in the US? I know we've these past 5 years, like it's gonna be 5 years. I don't know if it has been, but it's gonna be almost the fifth year anniversary of George Floyd. We went through October 7. We went through a global pandemic, uh, a new pope, a new president. What are some of, in light of these all these kind of uh monumental to we could call events. How do you see, what are your expectations for where religious liberty is heading, and how can the future generations learn from the experiences and horrors of the past of an event like the
Well,
Holocaust?
on the one hand, I think one has to you look at history's lessons. I had a colleague at one point, this is going back probably 3 decades now, who used to say, we, the Jewish community of the United States, are living in a bubble that, we think we're prosperous, we're respected society, we've advanced in some cases to high positions, and we think this is the way it's always got to be. And he would say, look at what happened with the Spanish Jews in the 15th century, who were expelled from Spain and Portugal. Look to what happened to German Jews who were, they were some of, they were a successful part of German society. They served in the military. They had businesses that were thriving. Some of them, I mean, every community has people that succeed and people that don't, but there were a lot of people who were succeeding, a lot of Jews who were succeeding in those societies. And then it just came crashing down. And he would say, look, so we shouldn't think that we're immune from those dynamics in this country. And, I think at the time we would have thought, he's overstating things, the United States is different. And now I hope the United States is still different. But I think you have to look at those lessons of history and take them a bit more seriously than maybe we're taking them 30 years ago. And so there's that. On the other hand, I am hopeful that the United States is different in some respects. I see that, for every case where something awful happens, whether it be Pittsburgh or it be Jewish students being subjected to, harassment and intimidation on college campuses, I do see others that push back, and getting enough people to push back. And here's the part where I'm going to allow hope to be the guiding principle. I think that over time, if we're strong advocates, if we build allies, if we adhere to principles that understand that protecting the rights even of those with whom we fervently disagree protects us as well. If we understand all of that, and also having understood all of that, nevertheless see that people that cross the line and that engage not in free speech but engage in action that's harmful to Jews and to others, that they pay a price for doing so. If we do all of that, I'm hopeful we can get to a place where we're all more comfortable with the society that we live in and that we're building. But it doesn't happen without advocacy, and it doesn't happen without a clearer understanding of what's going on, and not falling into simplistic understandings of current events and scapegoating members of society who are somehow held responsible for things that they're not responsible for, and that any event are based on an oversimplified understanding of the dynamic of what's going on. So, it's a somewhat long-winded answer to saying, I think you have to live in hope. Because otherwise, you can't, succumbing to a sense of despair that things are just going to get worse is a prescription for things getting worse, versus the need to push back and build a better society.
Well, Richard, we want to thank you so much for your time. It's been truly a privilege educating us a little bit more about religious freedom, also sharing from your own perspective, from your own faith tradition of what religious freedom means to you, how it has impacted you. And we always like to conclude ask with a question, our final question. Artificial Heart, it's a podcast dedicated to humanizing the hearts that have been cold due to secularization, disseminating the works of Dostoevsky to a popular audience, and reinvigorating and restoring Western culture with the timeless truths and values of the Judeo-Christian tradition. In light of that, in light of a lot of the discussions that we've been having, in light of the current events that our society, the world has been going through, how do you see public civic engagement and especially work with religious freedom, regardless of religion, race, or creed, as helping individuals gain greater meaning in life and also become more human?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to comment on the mission statement, which I took a look at
Oh yeah.
earlier. So on the one hand, I want to push back against the idea that you have to be religious
Oh yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah.
to have ethical
Yeah.
and moral grounding. There are
Yeah.
all kinds of ways. I mean, what we need to protect is the ability who are religious
Right.
to live out their faith, to look to those values, the values they find in their faith, as a way to be better people and to make those kinds of contributions to society. That's important. We also have to respect people who just as much are making important contributions to society, who don't come from a religious background. And more than that, some of the worst harms have taken place in the world have come from in the name of religion.
Yeah.
And I had an occasion some time ago to push back on the other hand to somebody who was saying, it was fair game for a in that case it was a commissioner, it was actually a Supreme Court case that turned on this. You had a commissioner in a case who said something about, it's fair game to talk about the horrible role of religion in addressing somebody who's seeking accommodation of their religious perspective. And I said that's deeply unfair. And in fact, it was right for the court to find that having a commissioner say something like that tainted the case because it showed a deep hostility towards religion per se, and therefore an antipathy towards the accommodation that was being sought. Whether or not they were entitled to that accommodation was a totally different question, a totally different legal question. And so I think both things are true, that people of faith or of no faith, grounding in their particular belief system, can be moral, make huge contributions to society, and on the other hand, huge harms can be done in the name of secular concepts. I mean, communism, Nazism are, certainly communists were hostile to the very idea of religion, and the Nazis, I think it's fair to say, sought to supplant religion. And on the other hand, there've been enormous harms, as I've already said, that have been done in the name of religion.
Got it.
I think it's people will complain about secular humanism,
Mhm.
and if it all depends what they mean by that. If they mean by
Yeah.
secular
Yeah.
humanism,
We mean more like what you were
yeah,
saying earlier, like forcing someone to be
yes, right.
secular.
If you're trying to force
Yeah, force. Yeah.
secularist perspective,
Not,
yeah,
and I think it's important that you highlight, yeah, by religious freedom here, we mean the freedom to be religious and to be a
not to be.
religion
Right,
as
right,
well. Yeah,
right.
that's very
So if by
thank
secular
you for
humanism
saying.
you regard this as, again, I use the
Yeah,
word evangelistic notion
yeah,
that
yeah,
that we're somehow entitled to force people to move away from their benighted
yeah.
belief in God,
Exactly.
and workplaces don't need to be receptive to people who are of deep faith. That's a problem. But if all secular humanism means, and
Yeah,
again, it's a
not
question of definition. People mean it's one of those things
yeah.
that people mean different things when they use the term.
Maybe a better word, secularizing or
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
I like secularist because
secularist. Yeah,
that has the connotation of a belief system versus secularism, which is to say a society that's built on the idea that the public institutions should be secular in that they are welcoming environments for people, whatever their religious or non-religious background might be. So I'm not sure. I'm trying to think what your question was again.
No, yeah, exactly. No,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, in light
So
of that, and thank you for clarifying that. That also helps for the future. But
right.
how do you see this work of preaching this not preaching, defending this message of religious freedom, the freedom to believe and to not believe in a religion as helping us become more human and avoid these fundamentalisms, both on a theocratic religious system or on a secularist uh, humanism or an
Yeah.
evangelistic
Yeah,
secular.
well, I think it's really important for people for those who are secularist in their own life, that they do outreach to and build alliances with people who are faithful, and similarly, that there be outreach across these lines from the religious side as well, so that they're building alliances with people of other faiths, with people of no faith. Many of the most effective coalitions, when I was doing legislative work for the American Jewish Committee, the most effective coalitions were the ones that brought people together across all these religious spectrum, political spectrums, people who had very diverse views and very diverse lifestyles, and yet were able to work together in common cause in just this thing, and in promoting principles that were supportive of freedom of religion. So I think that's that allyship, not thinking you can go and do this on your own, and it builds understanding, and then potentially has the possibility of making a change in terms of the public policies and the ways and the precepts on which our society is built.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for watching another episode of Artificial Hearts. If you want to see more content like you saw, informative content as we had here with Richard Foltin, please don't forget to like and subscribe and stay tuned for another episode of Artificial Hearts.